Sammy.
Thanks for doing this. I know it's beginning of the year, so...
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. Thank you. Good to...
And I just want to let you know that swears are okay.
Oh.
I mean, it's been a long journey for you, right? So I'm sure there was a couple F-bombs along the way.
Oh, just a few.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yo, welcome to My Summer Lair. I'm Sammy. Like most people, I'm strange, but I'm not a stranger. Younan. All right, story time. In the early 2000s, I was fortunate. I got an opportunity to visit Paris. And among the many tourist attractions I wanted to check out in the City of Lights was the Cemetery du Père Lachaise. Is that how you say it? Cemetery du Père Lachaise. Anyways, this is the cemetery where Jim Morrison, the lead singer of The Doors, was buried. So, on a warm summer day, I set off and I arrived at the cemetery. Started going through it, and it's a very old, ancient cemetery. There's a lot of people buried there, and you have a lot of those weathered tombstones. You know those ones where like they look a little crumbly? And I'm wandering through, and I'm also like not necessarily in a hurry. I'm kind of checking out the vibe. It's very weird to be like traveling and to go to a city, and like normally when you go to Paris, you go to the Eiffel Tower, the Arc de Triomphe. My French is terrible. All these different places, but you know, you don't generally expect to end up in a cemetery. So I was kind of taking my time and just taking in the vibe. Suddenly, these two tall German dudes came up, and they were speaking in broken English. They had the accent. That's how I knew they were German. And their English wasn't very good, but they were like, Jim Morrison, The Doors. And I said, so I pointed to my chest and I said, same, Morrison, as if it was some sort of like secret code or whatever for this club, like, you know? And so they're like, they smiled at me. And I'm like, okay. So we didn't exchange names or anything. We just kind of like, all we said was Jim Morrison. That was the only name we exchanged. And the three of us now set off on this path, this Lord of the Rings quest to find the Jim Morrison grave. And we're wandering around and we don't know where we're going. And we bump into this Spanish girl. She's maybe like late high school, early university, that age. Again, just very limited English, but she was speaking in fluent Spanish. She got excited because she saw me and she thought maybe I was Spanish. I'm like, no, I don't have los españoles. You just heard my French. So, no, that's not happening. But she said, you know, as she was speaking to me in Spanish, she said all three of us caught Jim Morrison and we caught The Doors. Again, one of the tall German dudes, he started doing like his little PB dance because he got all excited. And he's like, Jim Morrison, Jim Morrison, Jim Morrison. And she's like, yeah. See, she kind of shrugged. And so I pointed to like all three of us or four of us. And I said, look, circle. And then they sort of kind of got it. And so now the four of us are going off into this Paris cemetery to find the Jim Morrison grave. This is the same cemetery where Oscar Wilde is buried, but we're all here to find Jim Morrison, the lead singer of The Doors. Oscar Wilde's famous quote is, man is least himself when he talks in his own person. Give him a mask and he will tell you the truth. Give him a mask and he will tell you the truth. So honestly, it's no surprise Wilde is buried in the same cemetery as Jim Morrison. The Jim Morrison mask, it goes like this. On July 3rd, 1971, Jim Morrison died unexpectedly in a Paris apartment at the age of 27. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, although no autopsy was ever performed. It was not either required by French law or the mortician wasn't around, the coroner wasn't around. You can kind of pick and choose. You can kind of see how things are not quite adding up. Morrison was quickly buried on July 7, which is where we were trying to get to this gravesite, and there was only 4 mourners that attended Jim Morrison's burial. Hardly anyone saw the corpse. None of this makes sense. It seems a little suspicious. You can accept the narrative as it's given, but it seems a little off. Suddenly, we crossed over a path, and there it was. Jim Morrison's grave. And this profound silence came over all four of us strangers. And we stood still. There were just no words, no movements, frozen, as if we were playing a game of tag. Was Jim Morrison playing a game with us as well? Or did he break on through to the other side? Before the End, Searching for Jim Morrison is a 3-part docuseries written and directed by Jeff Finn. For over 10 years, he interviewed Jim's friends and families, his lovers, and much more in order to arrive at the truth, or perhaps a truth. Jeff believes, like I do, Jim Morrison did not die in 1971. Jim Morrison, the lead singer of The Doors, faked his own death. So what was I doing in a cemetery in Paris, standing at the edge of Jim Morrison's grave? Think of this 3-part docuseries Before the End as one of Robert Stack's unsolved mysteries. Remember those? Finn painstakingly makes a strong case. This isn't a conspiracy theory, rather this is a mystery, a cold case. One that is going to heat up. You can see Before the End, Searching for Jim Morrison. It's on video on demand, all the usual spaces. Amazon Prime Video, Apple TV, Google Play, all of those. Video on demand. Before this doc, I honestly believe Jim Morrison faked his own death. The conversation I have with Jeff, what you're about to hear, is based on that premise. We all agree Jim didn't die in 1971. But what does that mean? Is Jim Morrison still alive? I turned away from that grave in Paris. I felt unsettled. Like, I didn't feel satisfied. And I had trouble, even more trouble, accepting the narrative I was doomed to inherit. There had to be something else. There had to be, I don't know, something more. This is my conversation with filmmaker Jeff Finn. We talk about David Bowie and Elvis, and yes, of course, Jim Morrison. Truly and honestly, truly, these are strange days. The future's uncertain, and the end is always near. One of my favorite writers on The Storm is Stephanie, who's here with the introduction. Hit it.
Sound, the final frontier. My Summer Lair is an enterprise, a pop culture voyage with a continuing mission to explore strange new worlds, to seek out new creators and celebrate established producers, to boldly go where no podcast has gone before. And now here is your host, Sammy Younan.
Jim Morrison just had his birthday on December 8th. He was born in 1943. Do you have any rituals or something you do special on that day as a Doors fan or as a Jim Morrison fan? Do you commemorate that day somehow?
Yeah, honestly, I always take a moment and reflect upon Jim, and the trajectory of everything he went through personally, and then obviously what I've gone through in my own journey, trying to bring a deeper understanding to him, as a person, as opposed to a persona. There's a definite distinction between person and persona. And so, yeah, I like to reflect on that on his birthday for sure.
This idea of the persona and the person, I want to extend this thread because allegedly, according to your documentary, right? We'll get into that more, but Jim Morrison died in 1971. That was the cover story. But David Bowie's Space Oddity was released as a single on July 1969. And then, of course, by the time 71, 72 comes around, he had Ziggy Stardust. And I was curious, had Morrison, so let's assume that Morrison is alive, hadn't faked his own death in 71, right? So would he have been inspired by seeing people like David Bowie going through these different personas and personalities and things like that? That would have been an interesting kind of way out for him as well, other than necessarily faking his own death, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's a great question. I've never been asked before. And, I riff on that in my book. I've also written a book as a companion piece or a tie-in.
The 127 Fascination.
Yes, 127 Fascination, Jim Morrison Decoded. And in the book, I can get really detailed, fine details in the way I couldn't in a documentary. As proud as I am of the documystery, the book allows me to drill down even further. And in the book, I make that comparison. I riff on Bowie. Mm-hmm. I'm a huge, massive Bowie fan, the way I am a massive Morrison fan. And in my own, I've researched this guy, Jim, for 39 years now, 18, so I think I've learned a few things. And I can't definitively prove it, but I believe that Jim's Lizard King persona may have inspired Bowie's Ziggy Stardust persona. So even though Jim wasn't as, specific about it in the context of the stage, the way Bowie was, with the costumes and makeup and everything, I've always wondered that. Did Jim Morrison inspire, consciously or subconsciously, did he inspire David Bowie with regards to Ziggy Stardust? So it's fun to think that, and it's fun to think that would Jim have explored that more if he had gone on in a public career like you ask? I tend to think Jim would have gone more towards like spoken word meets jazz, or maybe even spoken word over electronics, but it's speculation, right?
Yeah, it's true. But it's just something like Bowie was very clear about it, right? Like in terms of the different characters that he introduced. Really, up till then, you'd only had somebody like Elvis who kind of went through these phases where like he came out was all clean cut. Then you had the bedazzled Elvis and the Vegas Elvis. You know what I mean? You had these kind of phases, but they were all essentially Elvis. Beatles, of course, had their they came out with the nice haircuts. Ed Sullivan, Nice Boys You Could Take Home, and then they did the drug stage. But they were more or less still the Beatles, right? But Bowie was very clear and had definitive characters. Like Ziggy Stardust, as I said, right? Just around the time that Morrison allegedly passed away. So it would have been interesting to see how he would have been inspired or influenced by those characters and those changes, you know what I mean? As somebody who was interested in all that poetry and avant-garde work.
It's fascinating. It's fascinating to maybe Morrison inspired Bowie, and then if Jim had kept going publicly, would Bowie have inspired Morrison? It would have been a really cool thing to consider. I wish they had met. To my knowledge, they never met. I think they're two of the most important figures, not only in the history of rock music, but in terms of just historical culture, period. I think Bowie and Morrison are vital to the history of culture.
They are, yeah. I want to pick up on this thread because, like I said, I've already kind of alluded to it, and you talked a little bit about it just now. Like, the subtitle Searching for Jim Morrison. So is this considered a conspiracy theory, or is this a cold case mystery? How are you looking at it, or how are you approaching before the end?
To me, it's a cold case mystery. I've said many times on the record, there's an old internet meme that's been floating around online for the better part of 2 decades that says, conspiracy theorist, nothing more than a derogatory title used to dismiss a critical thinker. And that's what I consider myself, a critical thinker. People can conspiracy theorist. I don't give a shit. Everyone's entitled to their opinion, but I know who I am. And very sober-minded researcher in the old school sense of critical thinking. And you when you do a project like this, you run the risk of confirmation bias. People are going to say, well, this is confirmation bias. You believe that. Obviously, at the end of the day, you're going to believe what you believe. People believe what they want, and I want people to, as Jim said, wake up. And critical thinking for themselves. Don't just take the controlled narrative that was put in place in 1971. The bottom line, we're going to get technical here. It's a cold case. It's a cold case that's never been solved. I had a former judge, 2 attorneys, and a forensic expert who worked in the FBI tell me that the evidence regarding Jim's death, such as it is, would never stand up in a court of law. So there you go.
Yeah. For the record, I agree with you. I think you believe that he faked his own death in 1971. But I agree with you just based on the fact that he died in Paris. Up till then, anybody who had a controversial death, from Elvis to Marilyn Monroe, JFK obviously was in Dallas, these guys were all in America. Even John Lennon died in New York City. But Morrison, quote unquote, died in Paris, and there's trains everywhere, there's villages. It's much easier to go and disappear in Europe. To get out of America, no one really gets out of America alive. It's a lot harder, right, to get out.
You did.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, but you know what I mean. That to me always kind of made sense to me, that somebody died in Paris or outside of America, and I'm that seems a little odd. There you go. No one gets out of here alive. Yeah, exactly. Right.
I don't know if that's showing up on the. There we go. Yeah, that's you're right on the point, man. It's I know I go deep on this in the doc, but I'm also on the record already is stating as much. So I'm not giving any spoilers here. There were two guys that Jim went to high school with in Alexandria, Virginia. One was a former attorney in the D.C. area, Washington, D.C., and one was a former judge. So these are highly respected guys in their community. And thanks to a guy named Mark Sosnick in his book, The Lizard King Was Here, which I highly recommend, Mark laid the groundwork for these two guys years ago with his self-published book. And these guys were named Bill Thomas and Randy Maney. And Bill, in particular, remembered distinctly in about 1961, when they were ready to graduate high school, that Jim Morrison said to him someday, this wasn't verbatim, but something to the effect of, someday I'm going to disappear and lead a different life, or an anonymous life. And at the moment, Bill Thomas was like, okay, Morrison, you're weird. These guys are 17 years old.
Mm-hmm.
But there it is right there. I think Morrison literally had, maybe he hadn't formalized it, but I believe he had a loose, what I call his 10-year plan.
Mm-hmm.
This is literally years before his alleged death. We're talking 1961 to 1971. And there he is at age 17 talking about disappearing. I think he began to plot it out right then and there, as absurd as it may sound on the face of it.
Mm-hmm.
But if people, as I have for 39 years, puzzle pieces begin to fall into place.
Well, so short of finding Jim Morrison alive, was there some sort of like undeniable evidence that you were looking for, like a smoking gun to prove or confirm your suspicions?
Oh, for sure. I mean, you're always looking for that smoking gun, And as I've said all along, can I definitively prove anything 100%? Of course not. We can't even prove definitively how this planet is here.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want
to
break it down,
we're all left. Yeah, like your previous documentary was Strange Septembers, right? Which is about a UFO encounter. And so
2 UFO encounters that allegedly took New Hampshire in the 1960s, the Betty and Barney Hill case and the Exeter case.
Mm-hmm.
And thinking about Strange Septembers, thank you for bringing it up. It'll always be my firstborn, my first doc. But that thing was just shot, as I've always said, punk rock style.
Mm-hmm.
I just shot it as a hobby, and I was going to put it up on YouTube. I never planned for that to be professionally released. But a production company at that time called Secret Handshake, they came along and wanted to put it out. So I thought, okay. But before the end, Searching for Jim Morrison is a completely different creature. I mean, the budget for Strange Septembers was, I believe it was $15,000. The budget for Before the End, Searching for Jim Morrison, far and above beyond that. Let's just say it's a totally different animal.
But what I'm getting at is it's very similar to like a UFO encounter where somebody tells you this fantastic story, like Betty and Barney Hill, and it's like there isn't quote unquote proof. You know what I mean? There isn't that kind of like, well, maybe if you believe in aliens, then you believe the story. But they seem like a very nice old couple. Like it doesn't seem like, you know what I mean? Like it stretches the mind and the imagination because, you know what I mean? If you choose to believe them, then you're going down this really strange road. And if you reject them, that could also be rude too if they've actually had this experience, right? Like that's the thing with like figuring out if Jim's alive or not, right?
Yes, and you got to remember, you're talking about comfort zones here, comfort levels. There's a comfort in the status quo, and there's a comfort in, the given, the known reality, so to speak. So in other words, and this was certainly true in Betty and Barney Hill's day, and it still holds true to this day. People cling to their beliefs, whether they're religious or spiritual or whatever, and they don't, by and large, most people, in my experience, they don't want to be shaken out of that comfort zone, So if you talk to them about the existence of aliens, they're like, oh, that's bullshit.
Mm-hmm.
There's no such thing. You talk to them about, could Jim have faked his death? Oh, what are you, crazy? So they gaslight you. You end up being gaslit. And I've been gaslit countless times in the last 12 years. And, like I said, I don't give a shit. At the end of the day, to each their own, But I'm just asking people who are interested in Jim Morrison to think outside the box and to look beyond the controlled narrative that's been in place since 1971. Dig deeper. Drill down.
Yeah, and so this idea of drilling down too, then like, let's go down this road because assuming then he did fake his own death and he took off and he was still alive, What do you assume then happened with his writing? Do you still assume that he published or even continued to write poetry? Do you think it's out there somewhere under a different name?
Well, that falls into the realm of speculation. But as I always, maintain, there's a distinction between speculation, generalized speculation, and informed speculation.
Mm-hmm.
There is things. And at the risk of spoilers, I mean, I'm on the record having believed that Jim did not die in early July 1971 in Paris. I've maintained that honestly since I was 18 years old, and I first read this book in October of 1985.
Mm-hmm.
So
no one gets out of here alive, a classic.
No one here gets out alive. Yes, and so, yeah, if Jim did in fact live beyond the faking of his death, of course, I believe his artistic pursuits would have continued. And it's fun to speculate that, of course, would he have gone on to continue writing? Would he have even made films? He was a film major at UCLA, and he was very interested in making documentary films. So, that's that's irony worthy of fiction right there. So who knows?
And then circling back to your documentary, as I mentioned, like on December 8th, 2024, Jim would have turned 81, which means a lot of the individuals you interviewed in Before the End, they're around the same age, right? Late 60s, 70s. There's a number of seniors. Was age a factor in agreeing to talk to you on camera to finally open up?
Yes. Thanks for pointing that out. I haven't had anyone point that out before. Yeah, I mean, for instance, Sally Stevenson, who was, an intimate of Jim's near the very end of his public life. She did one of the last formal interviews with him in October of 1970 for Circus magazine. And you can find that online. It's been online for, since the dawn of the internet. I begged Sally Stevenson to do the interview for years. And it took, I'll never forget this. I was like, I'm going to call her one more time and give it one more shot. And I did. And there was this big pause, and then she sighed. And I remember she said, "Oh, what the hell?" She said, "I'm not afraid anymore." And I was like, "Afraid of what or who?" And she said, I'm getting older now, and I think the truth should be out there. And we talked about the truth versus the real truth. And the real truth is what I'm after, not the PR spin or, the controlled narrative. So I was so grateful to her. As you said, a lot of these people were seniors, and I think they thought, it's time to go on the record and have their say.
For you as a kid, like you said, you started when you were 18. What set off your spider sense in terms of Jim Morrison's death? Like you talked just now about the official narrative, right? Which was that he died in the bathtub in July 1971. At home, there was a sealed coffin, all of that. But what set off for you? What made your spider sense tingle when you first heard about Jim Morrison's passing?
I mean, at that time, I didn't even know the term cold case. October of 85, I was 18. I was supposed to be attending college one day, and instead I blew it off and found this book.
We're back to always no one gets out of here alive, right?
That was my gateway. I was already a fan of the music, but reading this book, I read it in one night, and I'll never forget. I closed the book that night.
Mm-hmm.
I was at the very end here, no pun intended, and I closed the book, and I went, "No fucking way." And that's verbatim. I said that under my breath, though. I remember whispering in my head, "No fucking way." There's a way that he died when they alleged that he died.
Mm-hmm.
And it just didn't track. The puzzle pieces didn't fit. And, I've gone so far as to wonder, as I did even then, if Jim had lived, could he have been a ghostwriter on this book? How brilliant would that be to be a ghostwriter on your own biography?
But all of that fits with Jim Morrison, the way the character you paint, the actual person. He was a prankster and to kind of manipulate, I guess, emotions. Maybe manipulate is a strong word, but spark emotions, you know what I mean? And reactions from people. So faking your own death and then writing your own biography about how you passed away would be a very Jim Morrison.
Some of the details in this book, there's no way
mm-hmm.
that even the other Doors could have known some of this stuff, especially about his formative years before there even was a Doors band, So I don't know. The jury's out on that, of course. But was he a prankster? Absolutely. I mean, even in the earliest days of the band, when the first album came out, and this is on the record in this book,
mm-hmm.
he suggested that they pull a death stunt to drum up album sales for the first album. So here we have him talking about disappearing and leading a different life in 1961. Then in 1967, he's talking about pulling a death stunt. I have people on the record telling me that he spoke with them about faking his death and going under a different name. I mean, it goes on and on, you know. At a certain point, as I've said, do I have all the puzzle pieces? No, of course not. But I think I have the majority of them after 39 years, and a new picture, a clearer picture has emerged.
I want to stay with this idea of a clearer picture, because I find that your docuseries is also kind of a meditation on fame. Like when Jim Morrison allegedly died in 1971, how famous was he? Like what I'm getting at is, like, could people more or less identify him if he walked into a room? I'm sure most people at that time in 1971 could identify Elvis, but would they have recognized Jim Morrison if he walked into a room? Like, did he have a certain level of like ability to operate in the shadows, even though he was Jim Morrison, the lead singer of The Doors? Does that make sense?
That's a great question, man. Yeah, I think it's he definitely was a living legend, in his time in the public arena, the public eye. But I don't think it was a different ball game back then, like there was a generation gap for sure. And I think people over the age of 30, the old adage, never trust anyone over the age of 30, that's sprung from the late 60s. And so, I think the parents, unless they were really open-minded and progressive, they probably, if they knew anything about him, they probably just didn't want their kids listening to him or, being influenced by him. Whereas today, we're in the post-MTV era. MTV launched, decades ago. And so people are more dialed in about culture, and so the parents of today, it's like apples and oranges. But yeah, I think he was certainly notorious at a certain point. I mean, I say in my book that he and Charles Manson sort of shared public enemy #1 status in the U.S. as the 60s drew to a close. So, yeah.
That works, yeah. When can we expect the book to come out?
Yeah, the book is basically complete, and I'm in the stages of reaching out to literary agents, and I have a short list of independent publishers, like really brave, adventurous, fearless publishers. I would really like to align with that indie spirit because I'm an independent filmmaker. I'm a one-man operation. I don't have a crew or anything. If the right deal came along, I mean, I would be open to hearing it out. But by and large, I think I'm going to give it a number of months to see how that shakes out. And if I don't align with a really, legitimate deal, then I'll simply self-publish it the way Jim self-published his poetry. And as I've pointed out on the Facebook page recently, I was really inspired a couple of years ago by a guy named Jarrett Kobek, who wrote and self-published a book about his own research into the Zodiac killer. And I'm sure Kobek would be the first to say, did he definitively prove the identity of the Zodiac killer? No, but I think it's pretty well obvious that he did, and he's being humble, So that was really inspiring to see the way he went about that. So we'll see how that plays out too.
Yeah, so the book is called 127 Fascination, and the 3-part docuseries is called Before the End, Searching for Jim Morrison. Thank you so much, Jeff. Thank you so much for the documentary, too. That was a fascinating journey. I think in episode 1, you said we're going down this rabbit hole, and it literally was a rabbit hole. So thanks for the heads up.
That rabbit hole leads to many other rabbit holes, There's countless rabbit holes, endless rabbit holes down there. So the research never ends. But I appreciate you absorbing the documystery, and it's really good to meet you.
Yo, that was filmmaker Jeff, and you can see the 3-part docuseries Before the End, Searching for Jim Morrison on video on demand, Prime Video, Apple TV, Google Play, all the on-demand services. Morrison's death came 2 years after the death of Rolling Stone guitarist Brian Jones. and approximately 9 months after the deaths of Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin. All of the musicians I just listed, Brian Jones, Jim Morrison, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, they all died at the age of 27. This was the founding members of the 27 Club. This is how we get the emergence of the 27 Club. Additional and recent-ish members of the Grim 27 Club include Basquiat, the painter, Kurt Cobain, and Amy Winehouse. Pop culture is wild like that. My takeaway from this episode is the idea of a smoking gun. If you believe Jim Morrison didn't die in 1971, what's the smoking gun? Think about it. Like, if somebody says they saw a UFO, what's the smoking gun? You could say, oh, okay, sure, there's video, but video can be faked, right? That's always the classic rebuttal. What's the smoking gun? I write a weekly pop culture entertainment newsletter. My pal Sammy, it's on Substack. Sometimes I offer TV recommendations, other entertainment things, experiences that are pants-worthy. But for this episode, I want to explore the concept of the smoking gun. There's so much I didn't get to in my conversation with Jeff. Like me, if you want to get into all of this, and how could you not? Check out My Pal Sammy on Substack. Sign up today, and that's the smoking gun that shows me you care. Google My Pal Sammy on Substack and sign up today. Yeah, I'm more convinced after watching Before the End, searching for Jim Morrison. Jim Morrison did not die in 1971. Surreal. Thank you so much for listening to me, especially after that last pronouncement. But thank you so much for listening to me in the Netflix world. The Doors, yo.